The rejection didn't come with cruelty. That was the part that broke her most. It came with laughter. Low, private, intimate laughter, the kind shared between two people who believe they are entirely alone. Mara had been walking back from the Eastern Library, her arms full of leather-bound treaties she had spent 3 weeks translating from the old tongue at Alpha King Caspian's personal request. The corridor outside his private study was dim, lit only by the amber glow of oil sconces that flickered whenever the wind found the gaps in the ancient stone walls. She had learned to navigate this palace by its sounds. The particular creak of the third step on the western staircase, the way the grand hall hummed with echoed conversation long after the court retired, the subtle shift in air pressure when the king's chamber doors were open. She heard his voice before she saw the light spilling beneath the study door. She stopped walking without deciding to. She actually believed you needed her for the treaties? A woman's voice. Smooth, cultured, dripping with the particular amusement of someone who had never needed to work for anything in their life. Mara recognized it instantly. Lady Irons. Daughter of the Southern Coalition's most powerful warlord. She had arrived 3 days ago with a delegation of 40, and she had spent those 3 days looking at everything in the palace the way a buyer assessed an auction lot. She is useful, Caspian said. And then he laughed. It was a quiet sound, almost affectionate in its dismissiveness, the way someone might speak fondly of a well-trained hound. The girl has a gift for language. But useful is not the same as necessary, Inez. She forgets that sometimes. Does she know? Inez asked, her voice dropping into something conspiratorial and low. That I have already arranged an alternative translator for the summit? A pause, the sound of wine being poured. No, why would I tell her? She would only become difficult about it. It is better to let her finish what she has started, and then manage the transition quietly. Manage the transition quietly. Mara stood in the corridor for exactly 4 seconds after those words. She counted them because she needed something concrete to hold on to while the floor of her world tilted violently beneath her feet. 4 seconds in which the treaties in her arms suddenly felt like a monument to her own spectacular foolishness. 4 seconds in which 3 years of her life rearranged themselves into a shape she did not recognize. She had come to the Palace of Ashvane at 19, summoned from the border territories, because someone in the king's court had heard of the girl who could read 6 languages before she turned 17. She had grown up in the translation houses of the outer settlements, where knowledge was the only currency that kept you safe and fed and unsent back to the labor camps that processed the war's human cost. Language had saved her life before she was old enough to understand what saving a life truly meant. And then, Caspian had looked at her across his enormous war table, surrounded by his generals and his high-born advisors, and he had said, simply and with the full gravity of a man unaccustomed to being uncertain, I need someone who understands the Vethron dialect. Not its surface meanings, its undertones. Can you do that? She had said yes. She had meant it. She had meant every single thing she had given this palace over the 3 years that followed, the sleepless nights decoding hostile correspondence before it became hostile action. The summit she had single-handedly salvaged when the Meridian ambassador's translator misread a territorial clause that would have ignited a border war. The months she had spent building a lexicon of the dying Crescent tongue so that Caspian's kingdom would have a permanent record of a language that was disappearing in real time. She had done all of it, believing it mattered, believing she mattered. Managed the transition quietly. On the 5th second, Mara turned and walked back down the corridor. She did not run. Running implied panic, and panic implied that she was surprised, and she refused with every cold, deliberate step she took away from that closed door to be surprised. She had grown up in a world that taught its lessons in exactly this language. The language of being useful until you were not. the language of quiet management and careful transitions, the language of people who looked through you while appearing to look at you. She knew that language better than any other. What Caspian did not know, what he had never thought to ask about, because powerful men rarely asked about the full dimensions of the tools they used, was that Mara had spent the last 6 weeks doing something beyond her official translation duties. She had been finishing the Vethran Codex, the complete, annotated, cross-referenced key to every dialect, every regional variation, every historical inflection of the most politically sensitive language on the continent. The language in which every treaty of consequence for the last 300 years had been written, the language that 3 different kingdoms had gone to war over misinterpreting. The language that no living scholar outside of the border territories fully understood, and no living scholar inside the border territories had ever thought to systematize. It existed in its entirety inside a leather satchel in Mara's room, written in her hand, encoded in a secondary cipher only she knew. She had been planning to present it to Caspian as a gift. A contribution to the kingdom she had quietly, without fanfare and without expectation, come to consider her home. She reached her room. She bolted the door. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the flickering dark, and she pressed one hand flat against her sternum, feeling the particular hollow ache of something irreplaceable leaving a space it had occupied for years. It was not love, exactly. It was something more complicated than love. It was the devastation of discovering that the version of yourself you had most believed in, the one who was seen, who was valued, who had built something real, had only ever existed in your own mind. She sat with that for exactly 1 hour. Then, she opened her chest, removed the leather satchel, and began to pack. She was methodical about it. That surprised her, in a distant, clinical way. The part of her mind that was always observing, always cataloging, noted with detached interest that her hands were not shaking. The trembling she had expected, the kind that followed the collapse of something you had built your entire sense of safety around, did not come. Instead, there was a peculiar, almost crystalline clarity that settled over her as she moved through her small room, selecting only what was essential and leaving everything that was not. The ceremonial robe Caspian had given her after the Meridian summit. She folded it neatly and placed it on the bed. She would not take it. It had been a gift, and she had spent enough time in the border settlements to understand the difference between a gift and a leash. She left her court slippers. She left the silver inkwell his chamberlain had presented her on her 2nd anniversary at the palace, engraved with the royal crest. She left the pressed flower from the palace garden that she had tucked between the pages of her personal journal the afternoon Caspian had walked with her through the eastern grounds, and told her that her work on the Meridian claws had saved more lives than any sword he had ever drawn. She had believed him then. The memory of it now felt like pressing a finger against a bruise. What she took was precise and deliberate. Her traveling clothes, worn but warm, the kind built for distance rather than appearance. Her personal journals, dense with her own linguistic research and observations, irreplaceable and encoded against anyone else's understanding. Her mother's compass, brass and battered, the needle slightly unreliable but always, in the end, finding north. The leather satchel containing the Vethran Codex, and the small, unremarkable iron key that she had spent 4 months quietly duplicating from the palace's original, the key to the sealed vault beneath the Eastern Archive, where the kingdom's most sensitive correspondence was stored in the original Vethran. She had duplicated that key because Caspian had asked her to have access. He had trusted her with it because trusting her had been convenient. She took it because what it unlocked was not correspondence. Not tonight. What the vault contained, in addition to the diplomatic letters, was something that no one in the palace except Mara had thought to notice. A secondary collection. Old texts, predating the current kingdom by 3 centuries, written in the archaic Vethran script that no living translator in the palace could read. texts that she had spent 18 months decoding in her spare hours because the language was a puzzle, and puzzles were the only thing that had ever made her feel like herself. She had told no one about the secondary collection, not because she was hiding it, but because no one had ever asked. She slipped out of her room at the hour before dawn, when the palace guards rotated shifts and the eastern corridor was briefly, predictably empty. She moved through the familiar dark with the ease of someone who had spent years learning a building's breathing patterns. Down the servants' staircase, through the narrow passage behind the kitchens that smelled permanently of wood smoke and rendered fat, out through the herbalist's gate in the south wall, which was never fully latched because the night kitchen staff used it for smoking and had collectively decided that mentioning the latch to the head of security would result in more inconvenience for themselves than for any potential intruder. The night air hit her like a physical thing, cold and absolute and carrying the distant mineral scent of the river that ran 3 miles south of the palace walls. Mara stopped just beyond the gate, in the shadow of the outer wall, and she breathed it in deliberately. She had a scholar's habit of cataloging sensation, of filing experience away in precise language so that it could be retrieved and examined later. She wanted to remember this moment accurately, not with the softening that memory sometimes applied to pain, not with the embellishment that heartbreak sometimes applied to departure. She wanted to remember it as it was, cold, dark, necessary. She had been managing herself quietly for 3 years in service of someone else's kingdom. It occurred to her, standing in the dark outside the herbalist's gate with her mother's compass in her hand, that she had never once considered what it might feel like to manage something of her own. She walked south toward the river. She did not look back at the palace, not because she was performing indifference, the way she had seen other people perform indifference at moments of departure, manufacturing a dignity they did not entirely feel. She did not look back because the palace was already, in every way that mattered, behind her. The part of her that had lived there, the part that had translated and cross-referenced and salvaged summits and believed, quietly and without ceremony, that she was building something real. That part had died in a corridor, outside a closed door while holding someone else's treaties and listening. To the man she had trusted most in the world laugh about her with a woman who had arrived 3 days ago and already understood more about her situation than she had. That part was gone. What remained was walking south with a leather satchel and a compass, and a very particular kind of clarity that only came when you had finally, definitively, stopped waiting to be valued and decided instead to be valuable to yourself. She reached the river as the first gray light began to separate the sky from the tree line. She followed the bank east, toward the settlement at Vethrin Crossing, where she knew the dialect houses were, where she knew there were people who would understand immediately and precisely what the leather satchel in her arms represented. She walked steadily, without hurrying, with the particular composure of someone who had already outpaced the thing that was chasing her. She left with the one thing he could never replace, and she had not yet decided whether to let him know it was gone. The discovery came at mid-morning, not through any dramatic revelation, not through the tearful confession of a servant or the panicked report of a guard. It came through the mundane, utterly ordinary channel of Caspian's chamberlain knocking on Mara's door to summon her to the morning briefing on the summit preparations, receiving no answer, and eventually authorizing one of the junior household staff to check inside. The room was tidy. The bed was made. The ceremonial robe was folded with a precision that, to anyone who had spent time around Mara, was immediately and distinctly her. A precision that said, more clearly than any note could have, that this was not an absence. It was a departure. Caspian received the news in the war room, where he had been reviewing the summit's final agenda with his senior advisors and Lady Eanes, who sat beside him with the particular proprietorial ease of a woman who had decided, within approximately 48 hours of arrival, that she was already winning something. The Chamberlain delivered the report in the careful, neutrally toned language of a man who had learned, over many years of palace service, to deliver information whose implications he could not fully predict. The translator's room appeared to have been vacated. Her personal effects were largely absent. The Eastern Archive reported that the vault had been accessed sometime in the night, consistent with her clearance level. Caspian went very still. It was the stillness that his generals had learned, over years of campaign, to recognize as more dangerous than any volume or visible fury. The stillness of a man whose mind was moving very quickly beneath a perfectly composed surface. He asked 2 questions. The first, was anything missing from the vault? The second, where was the Vethran Codex? The first question produced a lengthy and ultimately inconclusive answer from the archive keeper, who had not yet completed a full inventory. The second question produced a silence that was, in its own way, deeply informative. The what? His senior linguistic advisor asked. Caspian looked at the man who had held his translation department's senior rank for 11 years, and he understood from the genuine blankness on the man's face that the Vethran Codex was something that exactly one person in this palace had known existed. And that person was gone. He stood up from the war table without explanation. He walked to Mara's room himself, because there are things a king needed to see with his own eyes to fully understand. He stood in the doorway and looked at the neatly folded ceremonial robe on the bed, and he felt something move through him that he did not have immediate language for. He was a man who prided himself on precision of thought, on the ability to analyze any situation cleanly and without the distortion of sentiment. He had built his reputation, his court, his alliances on that precision. He had told himself, numerous times and in numerous contexts, that Mara's value to his court was instrumental, practical, the kind of value that could be quantified and, in principle, replaced. He stood in her empty room and he felt, for the first time since he was a very young man inheriting a kingdom in crisis, genuinely uncertain. He retraced the night in his mind with his usual methodical precision. The conversation with Innes in his study. The laughter he had not thought to moderate because it had not occurred to him that anyone was listening. The careless shorthand of powerful men who assume their private spaces are inviolable. Manage the transition quietly. He heard himself saying it, and for the first time heard it from the outside, the way Mara must have heard it standing in that corridor with her arms full of work she had done for him. He left her room and summoned his head of security. He was told that the herbalist's gate latch had been, apparently, an ongoing issue. He dismissed the security chief with a restraint that cost him considerably. He walked to the eastern ramparts, the part of the palace wall that faced south, and he stood there in the cold morning air looking at the tree line beyond which the river ran. And he thought about what the Vethran Codex actually represented. Not its political value, though that was enormous. Not the summit implications, though those were immediate and serious. He thought about what it represented in terms of time and labor and the particular quality of mind required to produce it. He had been requesting linguistic support from Mara for 3 years, and he had understood in a general way that she was exceptionally talented, but he had never, he realized now, actually asked her to describe the scope of what she was working on. He had never asked because asking would have required treating her contribution as something other than a service, and treating her contribution as something other than a service would have complicated a set of assumptions he found professionally convenient. She had not told him because, he now recognized, she had been planning to give it to him. Not because it was her job, because she had wanted to. The cold on the ramparts was significant, and Caspian stood in it for a long time. Down in the courtyard below, the daily machinery of the palace ground forward without interruption. Guards changed. Deliveries arrived. The junior staff moved between buildings with the brisk purposefulness of people who had duties and schedules and no awareness that something irreversible had happened in the night. The summit was in 11 days. The primary agenda, the renegotiation of 4 border treaties written entirely in archaic Vethran, required a translator of rare and specific competency. His senior linguistic advisor could manage contemporary Vethran adequately. Archaic Vethran, with its layers of regional inflection and its embedded diplomatic conventions that had no direct modern equivalent, was an entirely different discipline. He had one person in his kingdom capable of it. She had walked south at some point before dawn with everything she needed and left behind everything he had given her. The deliberateness of the folded robe, the engraved inkwell, the absence of a note that explained or accused or demanded anything, told him something about Mara that he had apparently failed to understand in 3 years of proximity. She was not performing indifference. She was not manufacturing a dignified exit for the benefit of an imagined audience. She had simply, cleanly, completely left. And she had taken the one thing that could not be replicated by any alternative arrangement he might scramble to make in 11 days. He called for his fastest rider. Vethran Crossing was a settlement that had been built entirely around the one thing it had in abundance. Language. 300 years ago, when the Vethran territories were still a sovereign nation rather than a contested border region absorbed by successive expansions, the crossing had been the site of the great translation houses, sprawling communal buildings where scholars and diplomats and merchants gathered to navigate the particular complexity of a language that resisted simple acquisition. You could not learn Vethran, the old scholars said, by studying it. You had to be shaped by it. You had to understand the culture that had produced it, the particular history of a people who had survived centuries of being surrounded by larger nations by becoming indispensable as interpreters of everyone else's conflicts. Mara had grown up in the translation houses. She had learned to read in 4 languages simultaneously because the houses operated on the principle that language was not a subject but an environment, and children absorbed environments the way adults could not. By the time she was 12, she was being consulted on nuanced passages by adults twice her age. By 16, she had her own small desk in the senior scholars' hall, which was an honor so rarely extended to someone her age that the other scholars had debated it for 3 weeks before the house elder had simply moved the desk in and dared anyone to object. She arrived at the crossing as the morning market was opening, her boots damp from the river path, her satchel secured across both shoulders in the way she had carried it since leaving the palace. The market was small but dense traders and scholars, and the particular category of person who was both, who dealt in old texts and rarer knowledge with the same unsentimental pragmatism that other merchants applied to grain or cloth. Mara moved through it with the ease of someone who knew its grammar. She found Elder Sion in his usual place, at the back of the house's ground floor, bent over a manuscript with the particular posture of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to sit upright. He was 73 and had been bent over manuscripts in that spot for 40 of those years. He looked up when she came in and regarded her with the same expression he applied to everything quiet, measuring attention that had nothing performative about it. "You look like someone who walked through the night," he said. "I did," she said. He looked at the satchel. His eyes, still sharp at 73, took in its size, its weight, the way she held it. "Is that what I think it is?" She set it on the table in front of him and unclasped the top. He looked inside. His silence lasted a long time. Then he looked up at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, which was notable because she had grown up observing his face and believed she had catalogued most of its expressions. "You finished it," he said. 6 weeks ago. Does he know? She did not need to clarify who he was. In the context of the Vethran Codex, there was only one person the question could mean. "He knows it's gone now," she said. "He didn't know it existed before." Elder Sione was quiet for another long moment. He had the particular quality of silence that very old scholars sometimes developed, the kind that was not absence of thought, but the opposite of it. A silence so full that speaking into it felt slightly reckless. "What do you want to do with it?" he asked finally. It was the right question. She had been walking toward the answer for 6 hours. "I want to publish it," she said. "Through the houses, under the house's name, not mine. Available to every translation house on the continent, free of restriction." He looked at her steadily. That would make it worthless as a political asset. Yes, the king will not be able to use it as leverage. No kingdom will. It will simply be knowledge, available to anyone who needs it. Yes, that will make him very angry. Mara looked at the old man who had taught her what it meant to be a scholar rather than a servant of scholarship, and she felt the first genuine warmth she had felt since standing in that corridor. "He can manage that quietly," she said. Sione's mouth curved into something that was almost a smile. He reached out and placed one gnarled hand very briefly over the top of the satchel, a gesture that managed to be both careful and reverent without being theatrical. "I will need 2 weeks to prepare the copies," he said. "You will stay here while I do." It was not a question. She nodded. He gestured toward the interior of the house with the authority of a man who had never needed to make his hospitality elaborate to make it real. She picked up the satchel and followed him through the familiar corridors, past the long tables where younger scholars were already at work in the early light, past the reference shelves that smelled the same as they had when she was 7 years old, past the small window at the end of the East Hall that looked out over the river and had been her favorite place in the world before the palace had seemed, briefly and incorrectly, to replace it. He showed her to a room that was small and entirely functional and had a desk positioned directly beneath a good north-facing window. She sat at it for a moment, her hands flat on the surface, feeling its solidity. Feeling the particular quality of a space that was exactly what it appeared to be. No ceremonial robes, no engraved inkwells, no gilded implications, just a desk and a window and work to be done. She opened her journal and picked up her pen. Outside, somewhere on the road between the palace and the crossing, a fast rider was already moving south. She wrote the first line of what she had been meaning to write for 3 years, and the words came without difficulty, the way words always came when you were finally writing for yourself. The rider arrived at the crossing on the 2nd day. Mara was in the senior scholars' hall when he came, sitting across a wide table from Elder Sione, working through the first set of copied pages with the meticulous attention to accuracy that the codex demanded. She heard the horse in the courtyard before anyone announced it the particular urgency of palace riding, a pace that had nothing casual about it. That communicated its origin before the rider even dismounted. She did not look up from the page she was checking. One of the younger scholars came in with wide eyes and said that there was a royal messenger in the courtyard carrying a sealed letter with the king's personal crest. Elder Sione looked across the table at Mara. She finished the sentence she was checking, made a small correction in the margin, and then set her pen down. "Tell him I'll be out in a moment," she said. She took longer than a moment. Not out of performance, she genuinely finished the paragraph she had been annotating before she stood, because the annotation needed finishing and because one of the things she had decided, walking south along the river in the dark, was that she would no longer organize her time around other people's urgencies. She had done that for 3 years. She was done with it. The messenger was young, travel-dusty, and visibly relieved to have found her. He held out the letter with both hands, the way palace messengers were trained to present correspondence of particular significance. She took it. The wax seal was intact. She recognized Caspian's personal mark, the stylized compass rose he used only on private, non-official correspondence, which told her something significant about how he was framing this approach. She broke the seal. She read the letter, It was not what she had expected. She had prepared herself for several versions of this letter during the hours since leaving. The version that was coldly practical: your departure creates operational difficulties. Your immediate return is required. The version that was carefully worded to sound like an apology while actually being a summons. The version that ignored the conversation she had overheard entirely and focused on the professional relationship as though the conversation had not happened. The letter was none of these things. It was short. Shorter than she would have predicted from a man whose communication style she had studied closely for 3 years. It said, "I heard myself say it again this morning, the words I did not know you had heard. I said them in my own mind, replaying them as I stood in your empty room, and they sounded different when I heard them as you must have heard them. I am not writing to ask you to return. I am writing because you deserve to hear me say that the laughter was wrong and the words were wrong, and the certainty with which I believed I could manage your absence was the wrongest of all. I do not know what the Vethran Codex is. I am told it is significant. I believe it is significant because you made it, and everything you have made for this kingdom has been significant. And I did not tell you that enough, and I did not think to ask what you were working on because I believed that asking would cost me something. I understand now that what it would have cost me was the comfortable assumption that I could categorize you. I could not. I cannot. I am not asking you to come back. I am asking you to know that I understand now what I did not understand before." She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully, with the same precision she applied to everything, and stood for a moment in the courtyard with the cold morning air moving around her. The messenger watched her with the barely concealed anxiety of someone who had been told that this particular errand was of critical importance, and had not been told what a successful outcome looked like. "Tell him I received it," Mara said. "Is there a reply, my lady?" She thought about it. The genuine version, not the version she might have composed to perform indifference or dignity or strategic distance. She thought about what was actually true and what she actually wanted to say. "Tell him that I received it and that I read it twice," she said. "He'll understand what that means." The messenger looked uncertain. She did not clarify. She went back inside. At the table, Sione looked at her with his quiet, measuring attention. "Well," he said. "He wrote it himself," she said. "No secretary." Short, honest, she sat down and picked up her pen. The kind of letter a man writes when he's not sure what he's asking for. And, "What are you going to do?" She looked at the page in front of her, at the careful columns of Vethran script and their annotated equivalents, at the work that was going to be copied and distributed and made freely available to every scholar and diplomat and translator on the continent, permanently removing from it any possibility of being weaponized. She thought about the letter in her pocket. She thought about the laughter in the corridor. She thought about 3 years of work and what it had built and where she was sitting now. "I'm going to finish the codex," she said. "And then I'm going to decide." It was the most honest answer she had. It was also, she understood as she said it, a kind of power she had not known she possessed, the power of a woman who had taken the one irreplaceable thing and was deciding, on her own terms and in her own time, what to do with it. Sion nodded as though this was exactly the correct response. He bent back over his manuscript. She bent back over hers. Outside, the messenger rode north with a message that contained no direct answer and said everything. The summit was in 9 days when Caspian made the decision that surprised everyone in his court, including the people who believed they knew him best. He did not send a second messenger. He did not dispatch a negotiator or a diplomatic intermediary or any of the other mechanisms his court expected him to reach for when a situation required delicate management. He did not reassign the summit's translation duties to his senior linguistic advisor and proceed on the assumption that adequate would be sufficient. He had spent 2 days attempting to believe that adequate would be sufficient, sitting through preliminary briefings with his senior advisor and listening to the man's competent but entirely conventional rendering of passages that Mara would have unpacked in 3 additional dimensions without being asked, and understanding with increasing clarity that adequate and sufficient were not the same thing when the thing being translated was the foundational legal language of 4 treaties that would define his kingdom's borders for the next generation. On the 3rd morning, he rode south himself. He told his court he was conducting a border inspection. His court did not believe this, but also did not say so, because his court had spent enough time around him to recognize the particular set of his jaw that meant the decision was made and commentary would be unwelcome. Lady Inez watched him leave from the upper gallery with an expression that she kept carefully composed but which contained, for those equipped to read it, the first genuine uncertainty she had shown since arriving. Lord Vance present still, the alliance not yet formally concluded watched with the calculating patience of a man reassessing his position. Caspian rode without ceremony, a small escort, deliberately small, the kind that said this is private rather than this is official. He knew the road south. He had traveled it numerous times for border reviews, for military assessments, for the various practical duties that took a king out of his palace and into the actual geography of his kingdom. He had never traveled it for a personal reason. He was not entirely sure he was traveling it for a personal reason now. He told himself, with the habitual precision of a man who disliked ambiguity in his own motivations, that this was operationally necessary, that the summit required Mara's competency, that the personal letter had been a separate, appropriate acknowledgement of a professional failure and was not connected to the ride south in any causal sense. He stopped telling himself this somewhere around the river crossing, when he registered that he had been cataloging the landscape for signs of her footprint in the soft bank, a bent stem where someone had pushed through the riverside grass, and that this was not the behavior of a man conducting a border inspection. He arrived at Vethrin Crossing at mid-afternoon. The translation house was not what he had expected, though he examined this expectation and found it embarrassing. He had formed a picture, vaguely, of a modest provincial outpost. What he found was a sprawling building of old stone and newer timber additions that hummed with the particular energy of serious collective work, every window in use, the courtyard threaded with people moving between buildings with the focused purposefulness of scholars who had too many interesting things to attend to for their attention to be anywhere else. The smell was familiar in a way he could not immediately place, and then he placed it. It was the smell of Mara's room in the palace. Old paper and dried herbs and the specific mineral scent of quality ink. A young scholar of perhaps 16, utterly unintimidated by the king's escort or the royal markings on his horses, directed him to the senior hall with the brisk efficiency of someone who had more pressing things to do. He found Mara at a long table covered in manuscript pages. She looked up when he came in. Her expression was he searched for the word and found it legible, not guarded, not performing any particular response, not organizing itself for his benefit. She looked at him the way she looked at a difficult passage of text, directly, without assumption, waiting to understand what she was actually seeing before deciding what to do with it. He had stood in many rooms with many people watching him. He had never felt more precisely seen. "You rode yourself," she said. Not a question. Yes, she looked at him for another moment. Then she glanced at the scholar beside her, a young woman who was watching the exchange with the unabashed scholarly interest of someone who had decided this interaction was more instructive than whatever she was working on. "Give us a few minutes," Mara said. The scholar left with evident reluctance. The room was suddenly very quiet, the kind of quiet that translation houses had in abundance, absorbed into stone walls over centuries of serious thinking. Caspian did not sit. He stood on the other side of the wide table from her, with the manuscript pages between them, and he looked at the work spread across that table and understood, with a clarity that owed nothing to political calculation, what he had been doing and what it had cost. "The letter," he said. "I meant it. I know," she said. "I read it twice." He had wondered what that meant. Now, looking at her, he thought he understood. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Not about the summit. Not about the codex. I need to ask what you were going to do with it, before. What you were planning, before you heard what you heard in that corridor." Her hands were still on the table, resting on the edge of a manuscript page. She was quiet for a moment, and he recognized this silence. It was the silence she used when she was deciding how accurate to be. "I was going to give it to you," she said. "Not because it was my job. Because I wanted the kingdom to have it. Because I had come to think of the kingdom as something I was part of. The word he could not find earlier found him now. What he felt was grief. Clean and uncomplicated. The grief of understanding, too late and too clearly, the shape of something that had been real and that his carelessness had broken. "Is it too late?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "I'm publishing it through the houses," she said. "Freely, to everyone. It won't be yours exclusively. It won't be anyone's." He absorbed this. The political implications unfolded rapidly in his mind, and he set them aside. "That's not what I'm asking," he said. She knew it wasn't. She had known it from the moment he walked in. She looked at him across the table covered in her work, this man who had laughed about her and had ridden south himself and was standing in a translation house in the border territories asking a question he had not finished saying aloud. "Sit down, Caspian," she said. He sat. They talked for 3 hours. Not about the summit, though the summit came up eventually, towards the end. Almost as an afterthought, a practical question that answered itself once the larger questions had been addressed. They talked in the way that two people talked when they had been proximate for years without ever actually being present to each other, when circumstances had suddenly removed all the professional scaffolding that had made a certain quality of avoidance possible. Caspian had not had a conversation like this since his early 20s, when the weight of inheriting a kingdom in crisis had installed in him the particular habit of filtering everything through the question of utility before allowing it to register emotionally. He was not unaware of this habit. He had simply, over many years, decided that it was a reasonable adaptation to the demands of his position. Sitting across from Mara in the senior scholars' hall of the Veteran Crossing Translation House, he found himself revising that conclusion with the same methodical honesty he applied to revising intelligence reports when new information contradicted established assessments. She did not make it easy for him. This, he found, was something he respected with an intensity that caught him off guard. She was not hostile. She was not performing a difficulty she did not feel in order to make him work for something. She was simply present, asking him precise questions and waiting for precise answers and not accepting imprecision disguised as nuance, which was a diplomatic skill he had spent years developing and which she dismantled with the same calm efficiency she applied to badly translated treaty clauses. "When did you decide that useful and necessary were different?" she asked him. He thought about it honestly. "I think I always knew they were different," he said. "I used useful because necessary would have changed what I thought I was allowed to feel about the situation." She looked at him steadily. "What situation?" He met her eyes. "You know what situation." She did know. She had known for some time, the way a linguist knew the meaning of a word someone was deliberately avoiding through the shape of the space around it, through what was consistently not said. She had filed this knowledge carefully, and had not acted on it because it would have complicated a professional situation that was working, and also because she had not been sure whether what she was reading was real or constructed by her own wishful misinterpretation. She told him this. He listened to it the way she needed him to listen, without interrupting, without redirecting, without the impatient masculine inclination to reach the conclusion before she had finished building it. When she finished, he said, "It was real." She said, "I know that now." The afternoon light in the senior scholars' hall changed as they talked, moving from the sharp pale clarity of midday through the warmer, lower angles of late afternoon, casting long rectangles across the manuscript-covered tables. Other scholars moved through the hall at intervals, with the tact of people who understood that something significant was happening in the corner and had collectively decided to give it the space it required. Elder Sione appeared once, briefly, with tea that he set at Mara's elbow without comment, directing one sharp assessing look at Caspian before departing. Caspian had the distinct impression that the assessment had been unfavorable and that its terms were clear, and that meeting them was going to require something other than what he had been bringing to this situation thus far. He thought about Lady Innes. He thought about the alliance, and what it cost and what it was intended to buy. He thought about the particular architecture of the decision he had made, the way it had been constructed from assumptions that had seemed solid and had turned out to be exactly as reliable as assumptions always were, which was to say, reliable only until they met reality. The Northern Coalition's army was real. The threat to his borders was real. The political logic of the alliance was real. He had not manufactured the crisis in order to justify the choice. The crisis had been genuine and the choice had been rational. But so was this, and he had not, at any point in the careful rational construction of his alliance strategy, stopped to ask himself what he was actually doing, what he was actually trading away, and whether the trade was one he could live with once the immediate pressure of the crisis had passed. He had not asked, because asking would have required treating Mara's presence in his life as something other than a variable. She was not a variable. She had never been a variable. She had been the steadiest, most reliable, most genuinely irreplaceable element of his court for 3 years, and he had categorized her as instrumental because the alternative required him to admit something that complicated the architecture of a life he had built around the premise that power and sentiment were better kept in separate rooms. He said this to her, not smoothly, not with the practiced rhetorical elegance of a king addressing his court, with the halting, honest imprecision of a man saying something true for the first time. She listened to all of it. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "What happens to the alliance if you walk away from it now?" He had spent 2 days with his advisors mapping exactly this question. There were options. None of them were clean. Some of them were expensive. One of them, which his border commander had presented quietly and which Caspian had not dismissed, involved a completely different approach to the Northern Coalition problem, one that treated it as a military situation with a military solution rather than a diplomatic situation requiring a matrimonial sacrifice. He laid this out for her with the same precision he would have used in his war room, because she was, he understood finally, exactly the kind of mind he should have been using in his war room. She listened. She asked several questions that were better than the questions his advisors had asked. She pointed out an assumption in the border commander's proposal that had not been examined and that, on examination, turned out to be significantly flawed. He looked at her across the manuscript-covered table and felt, beneath the grief and the responsibility and the complicated specific weight of this particular afternoon, something that was almost relief. The relief of a man who had been managing alone for a long time and had just found that he did not have to. Outside, the translation house settled into its evening rhythms. Lamps were lit. The courtyard grew quiet. Somewhere in the building's depths, the smell of the evening meal began to drift through the corridors. Neither of them moved to leave. She did not return to the palace the next day. Caspian did not ask her to. This was, she later thought, the most significant thing he did in those early days, the thing that distinguished his actual change from a performed one. He stayed at the crossing. He sent word north that his border inspection was taking longer than expected. His court read this message with varying degrees of credulity and concern, and Lady Inez read it with an expression that she was no longer entirely bothering to compose, and Lord Vance began to have a conversation with his own advisors about contingency. Caspian spent the days at the translation house, not as a king conducting an inspection, not as a man running a diplomatic operation, but as someone who was genuinely trying to understand something he had not bothered to understand before. He sat with Sione, who spoke to him with the total absence of deference that very old scholars sometimes displayed toward even the most powerful temporal authorities, having reached an age at which the distinction between a king and any other person who hadn't done enough reading seemed less consequential than it once had. Sione talked about the translation houses and what they represented, what it had meant to people in the border territories to have places where knowledge was the currency and origin was irrelevant, what Mara had been, and what she had represented in this community since she was a child. Caspian listened with the genuine attention of a man who was doing penance of a kind that went beyond the formal, who understood that he was being shown something about the world that his position had systematically prevented him from seeing, and that the appropriate response was not to defend his perspective but to expand it. Mara, meanwhile, worked. The copying of the codex was proceeding, and she was needed for it, not just for quality control, but for the extended annotations she was adding, the explanatory frameworks that would make the codex genuinely useful to translators who had not grown up inside the language the way she had. She worked in the mornings with a focus that Caspian found, on the occasions when he passed through the hall, both remarkable and somehow characteristic. This was who she was when she was not organizing herself around someone else's requirements. This was what she looked like when the work was fully hers. He found himself stopping in the doorway more than once, watching her work with the slightly dazed quality of a man confronting something obvious that he has been refusing to see for an embarrassingly long time. On the fourth day, she appeared in the doorway of the small room Sione had offered him at dusk. When he was sitting at the desk going through the correspondence his chamberlain had sent south, the palace ran on paperwork and stopped for nothing, including a king's personal crisis. She leaned against the doorframe and looked at him for a moment. He set the correspondence aside. "Is it always like that?" she asked, nodding at the pile of papers. "That much of it? All the time?" "Yes," he said. "Who reads it when you're here?" "My chamberlain manages first review. I read anything flagged." She was quiet for a moment. He had the impression she was calculating something. "Show me the flagging criteria," she said. He looked at her. "Why?" "Because I'm curious what your chamberlain thinks constitutes significance. Based on 3 years of watching what reached your desk versus what didn't, I have some thoughts." There was something in her voice that was not yet amusement but was adjacent to it, a quality that appeared when she had spotted an inefficiency and was deciding whether to mention it. He had seen it countless times over correspondence and summit preparations and had never, he now realized, thought to ask her what she was noticing. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He spread the correspondence on the desk between them. She looked at it with the particular quality of attention she gave to everything focused, quick, structuring what she saw into a coherent picture with a speed that consistently surprised people who had not worked with her before. She went through the flagged items. She went through the unflagged items. She pointed out 3 things in the unflagged pile that she thought should have been flagged, and 2 things in the flagged pile that she thought were consuming his attention for no good reason. She was right on all 5 counts. He told her so. She looked at him with an expression that was unreadable for a moment, and then resolved into something that was, quietly, tired. "I noticed these things every time a summary crossed my desk," she said. "I didn't say anything because I didn't think it was my place." He held her gaze. "It was your place," he said. "It should have been your place. I should have made it clear that it was your place." She was quiet. Then that's a different kind of acknowledgement than the letter. Yes, he said. The letter was about what I did wrong. This is about what I want to do differently. Outside the small window, the crossing was settling into its night sounds the river, faint and continuous, the distant call of a scholar on the upper floor, the creak of old timber. She was sitting across a desk from him in a small room in a border settlement translation house with the accumulated correspondence of a kingdom spread between them. And there was nothing ceremonial about any of it, and this was the thing he had not had in the palace. The thing that the palace's gilded mechanics had made structurally impossible. The simple, unadorned reality of two people working together as though they were genuinely equal to the work. I want you to come back, he said. Not to translate, not as court staff. I want you to come back because the kingdom needs what you see. And because he stopped. He found the precise words. Because imprecision was a luxury he had forfeited. Because I need what you see. And I should have told you that before you had to hear the version of it that sent you walking south in the dark. She looked at him for a long moment. The lamplight between them was warm and steady. The codex goes out to the houses first, she said. That doesn't change. I know, he said. It should. And I won't be managed quietly. No, he said. You won't be. She looked at him for another long moment. Then she reached across the desk and picked up one of the unflagged correspondence items she had identified as significant, and she began to explain precisely why it required his immediate attention, and he leaned forward and listened. And outside the river ran south and the night settled over the crossing, and neither of them noticed when the lamp burned low. They rode north together on the 7th day. It was not the return she had imagined in the hours after leaving, in those cold pre-dawn miles along the river when she had been constructing, with the grim practical imagination of someone raised in uncertain circumstances, the various possible shapes her future might take. None of the shapes she had imagined had included this riding beside Caspian on the northern road, with the autumn countryside moving past in its copper and gold, 2 horses at an easy pace, the small escort maintaining a tactful distance behind. She had imagined returning, in one version, with leverage. The codex as a bargaining chip, something to be traded for formal recognition of her position and her contributions. She had rejected this version almost as soon as she had constructed it, because it required her to become someone she was not, someone who treated knowledge as currency in the transactional sense, which was the opposite of everything the translation houses had taught her. Knowledge moved freely, or it did not move honestly. She had imagined, in another version, not returning at all. Staying at the crossing, taking up the room with the good north window, building a life around the work itself rather than around the institution that used the work. This version had a clean appeal. It was uncomplicated. It did not require her to trust anything that had already broken once. She had not imagined this version because it required trusting something that had already broken and that appeared to be rebuilding itself in real time, which was a different and considerably more frightening thing to trust than something that had never broken at all. She watched Caspian as they rode. He was different outside the palace. The particular quality of his authority was present in everything he did. It was not a costume he wore. It was a structural feature of how he moved through space, but it was unperformed. He was not in his court. He had no audience except her and the small escort and the autumn countryside, and in the absence of an audience he was simply a man on a horse. Occasionally pointing out a feature of the landscape or asking her a question about the crossing or the translation houses that was genuinely curious rather than diplomatically framed. She answered his questions, honestly. He listened with the quality of attention she had identified in those first days as his most significant characteristic, the ability to hear something fully before responding, to resist the powerful person's inclination to finish other people's thoughts because thinking faster than them was something you could do, and therefore assumed you should. "What will Sione think?" Caspian asked. They were crossing the open farmland north of the river, the palace's tower just visible on the horizon, a dark pencil line against the white sky. Of what? Of you going back, she considered. He'll think I'm taking a risk, she said. He'll also think that taking calculated risks on incomplete information is what translators do, and that my read of the situation is probably more accurate than his because I have more data. Caspian was quiet for a moment. Is that how you think of it? As a calculated risk? She looked at him. The honest answer and the diplomatic answer were the same answer, which was one of the things she had decided she was going to insist on going forward, that in her interactions with this man, the honest answer and the diplomatic answer would always be the same. I think of it as a choice, she said. Calculated risks are what you take with situations you don't control. Choices are what you make with situations you do. He looked at her. And you think you control this situation? I think I control my part of it, she said, which is the only part I've ever controlled. The difference is that now I know it. He held her gaze for a moment with the expression she had begun to identify as his version of being moved contained, composed on the surface, and entirely visible beneath that surface to anyone paying attention. I'll need you to tell me, he said, when I'm wrong. When I'm being the kind of king who manages things quietly rather than addressing them honestly. I have a court full of people who have every incentive to not tell me that. I know, she said. I've watched them for 3 years. Will you? She thought about the conversation in the correspondence room at the crossing, the 5 items she had identified, the way he had leaned forward and listened. She thought about what it required of her, not just competency, which she had always had, but presence, which she had been withholding for 3 years because the professional scaffolding of her role had made withholding feel like wisdom. She thought about the version of herself that had walked south in the dark with a leather satchel and her mother's compass, not running but choosing, the version that had sat at Sion's desk and written the first line of something that was finally entirely her own. She had not left that version at the crossing. She had packed her, carefully, along with everything else. Yes, she said, I'll tell you. They rode in silence for a while. The palace grew clearer on the horizon, its familiar lines resolving from abstraction into specificity. She had looked at those lines for 3 years and never thought to ask whether the familiarity was the same as belonging. She was asking now. The answer was more complicated than yes and more honest than no. Belonging was not a property of a place. It was a property of the conditions within a place, and conditions could change, and she had spent a week watching conditions change in real time and making a careful, scholar's assessment of whether the changes were structural or superficial. They were structural. She believed that. She was also aware that she was a person whose belief was an informed reading of available evidence and not a guarantee, and that reading evidence was what she did, and that she had been wrong before. And that being wrong before did not mean she should stop reading. She rode toward the palace with the leather satchel across her shoulders and her mother's compass in her pocket, and the particular composure of a woman who had walked away from something, learned something essential about herself in the walking, and come back not because she had been persuaded, but because she had chosen. The gates of the palace opened before them. The courtyard staff observed her return with the careful neutrality of people who were registering something significant and were too professionally experienced to show it. Lady Inez, who appeared at an upper window for a moment before withdrawing, observed it with less neutrality. Mara dismounted. She stood in the courtyard with the familiar palace smell around her, cold stone and wood smoke, and the faint salt of the kitchens. The chamberlain appeared at the entrance with the composure of a man who had been doing his job for too long to express surprise at anything. Your room has been kept exactly as it was, he said to her. She looked at him. She looked at the ceremonial robe and the engraved inkwell she had left behind. She thought about the north-facing window at the crossing and the clean, functional desk and what it had felt like to work in a space that was exactly what it appeared to be. "I'll need a larger desk," she said. The Chamberlain did not blink. "Of course," he said. She walked inside. The summit convened 5 days later. The delegations arrived in order of distance, which placed the Meridian contingent first, and the Northern Ridge last Lord Vance and Lady Seraphina, entering the great hall with the careful composure of people who had spent several days revising their expectations and had not yet fully made peace with the revision. Seraphina moved through the assembled delegates with the trained grace of someone who had been raised for exactly this kind of room, her pale eyes assessing everything in a single slow sweep, finding Mara at the translation table and holding for exactly 1 second before moving on. Mara did not find that second troubling. She found it informative. It told her that Seraphina had understood the situation accurately and had the intelligence to adjust her position accordingly. It told her that whatever Lord Vance was planning, his daughter was already 3 steps ahead of his planning and was making separate calculations. This was useful information for the summit, and she made a mental note of it with the same professional calm she brought to all such observations. The summit chamber was arranged differently than it had been for previous summits she had attended as support staff, positioned at the edge of the room behind the translation table. Invisible in the way that functional people often were in formal settings. This arrangement had been changed at Caspian's direction, communicated to the Chamberlain with a quiet specificity that had produced a new table placement without any public explanation requiring one. The translation table was no longer at the edge of the room. It was positioned to the immediate left of the main negotiating table, in the sightline of all delegations, an architectural decision that communicated, to anyone fluent in the language of formal space, that translation here was not support work. It was primary work. The 4 treaties to be renegotiated were laid out in the original Vethran documents 3 centuries old. Their parchment the color of old bone, their script the dense and intricate archaic form that had given numerous kingdoms numerous diplomatic headaches over numerous generations. Mara had spent the 5 days since returning to the palace preparing not just her translation notes but her annotation structure, a framework for communicating to the negotiating delegates not just what the original text said, but what it had meant, what it had been designed to achieve, and where the original drafters had embedded ambiguities that subsequent interpreters had either missed or exploited. This framework was new. No previous translator working these treaties had provided it. It was, functionally, the gift she had intended to give Caspian before she had heard the laughter in the corridor, applied now, not to a private presentation, but to a summit that would shape the borders of 4 kingdoms for the next generation. The opening session began. The first treaty was placed before the room. The lead Meridian negotiator, a sharp-eyed older man who had been at 3 previous summits and had a reputation for finding the fault lines in any legal text, leaned forward with the particular eagerness of a specialist presented with a complex problem. Mara read the opening clause aloud in its original Vethran. Then, she translated. Then she paused, as she had told Caspian she would, and she said, "Before we proceed, I need to draw the room's attention to something in this clause that has been misread in every previous negotiation involving this treaty." The room became very still with the specific quality of stillness that experts produced when they understood they were about to learn something important. She explained. She took the room through the embedded conditional that 3 previous translators had rendered as an absolute, and what the difference between a conditional and an absolute meant in the context of territorial sovereignty, and what 3 generations of kingdoms had agreed to under the mistaken impression that they were agreeing to something else. She did this clearly, precisely, without drama, in the manner of someone presenting information that belonged to everyone in the room. She did not present it as her discovery. She presented it as a fact that had been waiting to be correctly read. The Meridian negotiator said, after a silence that lasted several seconds, "We've been operating under that misreading for 80 years. Yes, Mara said. He looked at her with the expression of a man who was simultaneously distressed and deeply professionally grateful. Then he laughed, not the laughter of dismissal, but the startled, helpless laughter of someone who had just had the ground shifted beneath them in a way that was going to cost enormous effort to address, but was unambiguously correct. "Good God," he said. "All right. Let us go back to the beginning." They went back to the beginning. The summit that had been scheduled for 4 days ran for 8. Not because of conflict, though there were difficult sessions, particularly when Lord Vance attempted, on the 3rd day, to use a different embedded clause to advance a territorial claim that the corrected reading of the first treaty had closed. Mara handled this with a precision that stopped the attempt so cleanly that Vance had no rhetorical ground to stand on and knew it. He accepted the correction with the face of a man doing arithmetic that was not resolving in his favor. On the 6th day, during a recess, Serafina appeared in the corridor outside the summit chamber. She approached Mara directly, which was itself a kind of statement, and she said without preamble, with the same cool intelligence that Mara had correctly identified as operating independently of her father's strategy, "I would like to speak with you. Not about the summit. About the secondary texts in the Eastern Archive. The collection that no one here can read." Mara looked at her steadily. She had not been expecting this. She filed it, with the scholar's reflex, under things that required more information before responding. "What about them?" she said. "I can read them," Serafina said. "The archaic form. My mother's family were veteran scholars before the annexation. She taught me as a child." She held Mara's gaze with the directness of someone who had calculated the risk of this admission and decided to take it anyway. "I've been waiting for 3 days to find a context in which to mention it that didn't sound like a strategic maneuver." Mara considered this for a moment. "Does it matter if it sounds like one?" "It matters if it is one," Serafina said. "It isn't. I'm leaving with my father in 2 days. Whatever the outcome here, the alliance isn't happening in its original form, and I think we both know that. What I'm telling you about the archive is separate from that." Mara looked at the woman her king had been prepared to marry in exchange for an army, and she saw with the scholar's vision that looked past surface and read what was underneath someone who was considerably more interesting than the role she had been assigned. "Come to the archive tonight," she said. After the evening session, Serafina nodded, once, with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to operating in narrow windows of opportunity. She came. They spent 2 hours in the archive with the old texts, 2 women who had both been positioned as political variables by men who had not thought to ask what they were actually made of, reading a dead language together in the lamplight. Finding in it what scholars always found in texts that had survived beyond their expected lifespan, the persistent, irreducible evidence of people who had thought carefully and written honestly and trusted that someone, eventually, would understand what they had meant. It was, Mara thought, a good use of 2 hours. The summit concluded on the 8th day with 4 renegotiated treaties, 1 withdrawn territorial claim, 1 dissolved betrothal arrangement, and 1 new framework for border management that Mara had drafted in a single late-night session, and that the Meridian negotiator had called the clearest piece of legal language he had encountered in 40 years of diplomatic work. This was said in front of the full assembly, in the kind of public, unreserved professional acknowledgement that Mara had not received in 3 years of work that had consistently merited it, and she absorbed it with the composed attention of someone who was learning, slowly and deliberately, to let things land rather than deflecting them before they could. After the formal closing session, after the delegations had moved to the reception hall and the palace staff had begun the organized dismantling of the summit chamber, Caspian appeared in the doorway of the archive room where Mara was returning the original treaties to their cases. He watched her for a moment. She was aware of him watching and continued what she was doing, because the documents needed to be handled correctly, and correctly meant with full attention. When she had finished, she turned. He said, "I watched you redirect Vance on the third day. The territorial claim." "I know," she said. "I could see you from the translation table. You stopped it so cleanly that he had nowhere to go." "The text stopped it," she said. "I just read the text correctly." He looked at her with the expression she had catalogued as his version of being moved. "You know that's not all you did." She did know. She also knew that the distinction she was drawing between her own contribution and the text's was a genuine one, not false modesty. The text had always been there. The reading was what she had brought. Both things were true simultaneously, which was the kind of complexity that language handled well and that power structures often tried to flatten. "What happens with Vance now?" she asked. "He goes north," Caspian said. "The territorial claim is closed. The alliance is dissolved. My border commander is presenting an alternative strategy in 3 days." He paused. "I'd like you in the room for that." She looked at him. "I'm not a military advisor." "No," he said. "But you read the Vethrin conditional in the first treaty, and you told the room something that 80 years of negotiations had missed. I'd like to know what you see when you look at the border situation." He held her gaze with the steadiness of a man who had stopped treating the question of what she was for as a question with a predetermined answer. "I'd like to know what you see when you look at most things." Outside the archive windows, the palace courtyard was clearing of the last delegations. The Northern Ridge contingent was mounted and moving toward the gate's Lord Vance, with the stiff bearing of a man carrying a defeat he had not anticipated, Serafina riding beside him with the slightly different bearing of a woman who had come away from a situation with something her father hadn't planned for. As they crossed the courtyard, Serafina looked up at the archive window. She met Mara's eyes through the glass with a direct, composed recognition that carried everything that did not need to be said between two people who had spent 2 hours reading a dead language together in lamplight. Mara raised one hand briefly. Serafina inclined her head. Then the Northern Ridge contingent passed through the gates and were gone. "What was that?" Caspian asked. He had been watching. "The beginning of a correspondence," Mara said. She turned back to the archive. "She can read the secondary collection. The archaic texts. We're going to work through them." Caspian was quiet for a moment. Then, "She's Vance's daughter." "She's also a scholar," Mara said. "And her mother's family were Vethrin. The two things are not in conflict unless you decide to make them in conflict." She looked at him. "Are you going to make them in conflict?" He looked at her for a moment with the expression that meant he was revising something. "No," he said. "Good." She moved to the next case, checking the seals. "The archive has been under-catalogued for 20 years. The secondary collection alone could take a year to properly assess. I'm going to need an assistant. I'll authorize it," he said. "I'll need direct access to the war room correspondence when it's relevant to diplomatic preparation. Done, and I'll need the Chamberlain to understand that my desk is not to be moved without my instruction." He almost smiled. "I'll make it a formal decree if you prefer." She looked at him over her shoulder. "That would be excessive." "Probably," he agreed. He moved into the archive properly, crossing to the secondary collection she had indicated, looking at the old texts in their cases with the attention of a man encountering for the first time something that had been in his possession for years without his knowledge. He reached out and touched the spine of the nearest volume, carefully, the way she had taught him without gripping, fingertips only, respecting the age of the thing. She had shown him this during the summit, in passing, and he had retained it without being reminded. She noticed that he had retained it. She filed it, as she filed everything, in the place where it belonged. "Mara," he said. He did not look up from the text. His voice had the quality it had taken her 3 years and a week's absence to hear clearly unguarded, stripped of the sovereign register, simply his. "Thank you for coming back." She thought about the corridor, and the laughter, and the 4 seconds in which her world had rearranged itself. She thought about the river road in the dark and Elder Sione's desk, and the first line she had written that was entirely her own. She thought about 8 days of a summit, and 2 hours in lamplight, and a woman on a horse who had raised her hand and had it returned. She thought about what she had carried out of this palace in a leather satchel, and what she had decided to do with it, and what she had come back carrying not less than she had left with, which was what she had half feared, but more. Herself more completely, her work more fully hers. The knowledge, earned rather than assumed, that she could leave, and that she had chosen to return, and that the choice was the thing, and that the choice would always be hers. "Don't laugh about me with other people," she said. Her voice was even, without heat. A statement of condition rather than accusation. The kind of line that was drawn once and did not need to be drawn again. He looked up. He met her eyes with the fullness of attention she now understood was what he looked like when he was entirely present. "Never again," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, reading it with the care she brought to everything she read. She found it honest. She found it real. She returned to the archive cases, resuming her work, the systematic, careful work of someone who was building something that would last. "The secondary collection," she said, "the oldest texts. I think there's a third treaty in there, one that predates all 4 we just renegotiated." She glanced at him. "If I'm right, it changes everything." He crossed the archive to stand beside her, looking at the cases. "How long will it take to know?" "Months," she said, "maybe longer. It depends what we find." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the simple, unceremonious directness of someone who had recently learned the cost of indirection, "Then we had better start." She opened the first case. He stood beside her and looked at what was inside with the appropriate reverence. She began to explain what she was seeing, and he listened wholly, carefully, without interrupting, and outside the archive the palace continued its ordinary life, and the autumn light moved across the old stone walls, and the river ran south toward the crossing, where an old scholar was copying something important so that everyone could have it, and in the archive, a woman who had left with the one thing that could never be replaced had come back to build something new from. It, something that was hers and chosen and real. She had walked into the dark and found herself on the other side of it. And that, she thought, turning the first page of the oldest text in the archive, was enough. It was, in fact, everything